Hello, welcome to week 4. Our subject tonight is going to be anxiety. So, a lot of what we talk about tonight will be things that probably most of us have experienced before. We may think all of us probably have people in our life who've struggled with anxiety. Maybe we have struggled with anxiety. It is one of the more common psychological disorders when we're talking about, when we give out statistics, we talk about maybe like 1 in 4, sometimes even 50% of the population has a psychological disorder, a diagnosable psychological disorder. The majority of these are going to be things like depression and anxiety. They are far more common in population than things like schizophrenia or other disorders that are a little bit more rare, bipolar disorder, things like that. Nevertheless, they're still not things that everyone deals with, but if we all deal with, think back to the first week, we're talking about the difference between normal and abnormal. So this is one of those places where that really comes to light, because we all have dealt with normal anxiety. We've all dealt with feelings of apprehension or being nervous, being anxious, and it's a term that we use every day. So the things that we're going to be talking about here, we're talking about sort of extreme varieties of things that all of us have dealt with, or symptoms that all of us have dealt with. So when we're talking about these will all sound familiar, but they may sound familiar in a level that's a little more extreme than what we personally deal with. This class, I will upload the PowerPoint slides, and probably, like most of the time, you'll see the PowerPoint slides and all the other stuff that I upload before I actually upload the video. This video may be a little bit longer, so if it starts to get around 30 minutes, I'm going to cut it off and just start a second video, because it takes a long time to upload, and I don't want to run into the situation I ran into last week where I had to repeat the whole thing. But also, please take a look at the PowerPoint slides as you're listening, because I'll refer to there's several of the slides that have DSM criteria. Remember, the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it's the criteria that we use to determine who meets diagnostic criteria for each disorder. So the slides are in there, and I'll talk about them, but it will be helpful to you when you're reading them to reference that. I'm going to scoot over so maybe my head will block this light here, so let's see if that'll work. I just can't move around a lot, so hopefully that does help a little bit. I also have the door open right here, so if you hear like an abnormal number of cicadas or cats or other animals, it's probably from the door. Also, just a note about the setup. I've been listening to these, and I'm not entirely happy with the sound quality, so I'm working on getting a better setup for all of this. So hopefully these will get better as we go along. So when we talk about anxiety disorders, what we're talking about here is pervasive and persistent symptoms of anxiety and fear. So these are pervasive, which means essentially across settings and things that are routine that happen all the time. If you have symptoms of anxiety that only arise, say, before you're about to take a test, or symptoms of anxiety that only happen, when you're dealing with something unique or stressful, or like a first date, or something like that. That's entirely normal. It's also not pervasive. It's not across settings. It's not in multiple settings. So pervasive is the key there. Also persistent. These are symptoms of anxiety that happen very often. If not constant anxiety, most of the time, especially in the given situation. For example, when we're talking about phobias, if you have a phobia of spiders, which is fairly common when we're dealing with phobias, you have a persistent and pervasive fear of spiders. It's not sometimes when you see a spider. It's every time when you see a spider and in every situation. So it is pervasive and persistent. If you only sometimes experience anxiety when you see a spider, if you only sometimes are afraid of dogs or lightning or any of the other things that people are having phobias for, then it's not really going to reach the threshold of something that we would consider a phobia. Also, we have one of the characteristics of an anxiety disorder is a fear, ongoing fear, but also an excessive avoidance or escape from that fear. So we will go out of our way to avoid things that make us anxious. A good example, if you are afraid of driving over a bridge, this works way better when we're in class, right? Because like I'm not near a bridge, but you think about the Clays Ferry Bridge. If you're traveling to Richmond, pretty much from the north at all, you're going to have to cross the Clays Ferry Bridge. If you have a pervasive and persistent fear of bridges, you're going to go out of your way to avoid driving across the bridge. So that becomes impairing in your life. If you're an EKU student and you live in Lexington, you're going to have a hard time getting to class without crossing a bridge. So it's going to impact your life. It's also probably going to impact your choice of what school you're going to go to. You're probably not going to go to a school where you have to cross a bridge on a regular basis. So we avoid that. If you have a fear of people, agoraphobia, you have a fear of going out in social settings where you may have a hard time escaping, which is agoraphobia. We'll talk about that in a minute. And you go out of your way to avoid public situations, then that is a characteristic of an anxiety disorder. So, you may really need to leave the house. You may really need to go to the grocery store, or you may really need to be in situations that you're afraid of, and you go out of your way to avoid those. So it creates this enhanced pattern, conditioned behavior. We go out of our way to avoid whatever we're afraid of, and that only strengthens and reinforces the avoidance behavior, because as you avoid that, your fear is reduced. If I'm afraid of driving across a bridge and I get close to a bridge and say, "Oh hell no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to go back," then our anxiety decreases as we turn around and go the other direction. So that, you think back to classical conditioning, we're strengthening the avoidance behavior, which in turn strengthens the fear response, enhancing the anxiety. And then the last characteristic of anxiety disorders is that it causes significant distress and impairment. And these are pretty easy to see. And this is the big difference between what becomes disordered and what is normal, is this significant distress and impairment. If you have some anxiety about heights, that's one thing. You can go out of your way to avoid getting on roller coasters, or to go to the top of the Eiffel Tower, and it's not really going to impact your life in any meaningful way. But if you have an anxiety disorder that's so severe that you have trouble being in classroom buildings with multiple floors, then that is probably going to impact your life in a more serious way. So there's different factors that come into play here. What some of the hallmarks, the building blocks, I guess, of anxiety disorders is a panic attack. If you've ever had a panic attack, you don't forget it. It's very intense, very memorable, and causes a lot of distress. By definition, it's an abrupt experience of intense fear. That's what your textbook refers to it as. And you have physical symptoms: heart palpitations, your heart's beating really fast, chest pain. Most of the visits to emergency rooms for heart attacks actually end up being anxiety attacks, because it feels very similar. You have your heart's beating, your heart's racing, you're having pain in your chest, you have dizziness, sweating, chills, or heat, depending. And all of those sound like a heart attack. So people often go into the hospital, go to the ER, call an ambulance because they're afraid they're having a heart attack when in fact it's an anxiety attack, a panic attack. Also, cognitive symptoms, fears of going crazy and losing your mind. Also, feeling that you might die. Because again, you have all these physical symptoms. They're very real physical symptoms. You're not making them up. Your heart is racing. Your pulse is more rapid. You are having dizziness. You are having sweating, and so it feels bad. So, that there's this real sense of something bad is going to happen to you. If you've ever had one, it's not easy to forget. Two types of panic attacks: expected and unexpected. Unexpected are panic attacks where we can't trace back an immediate trigger. So I mentioned the fear of driving over a bridge. If you're driving over a bridge and you know you're afraid of that and you experience a panic attack as you're doing it, that's expected. If you are in the middle of your day, you're sitting in your house, you're watching TV, and all of a sudden you have all these symptoms. You have the heart palpitations and sweating, and you're feeling like you're losing your mind or you might die. That's not expected. There was no direct, clear trigger. And so unexpected panic attacks tend to be harder to deal with because it's harder to nail down a cause. And the other thing with panic attacks is that sometimes the trigger isn't immediate. So you have a really stressful day, you're having lots of anxiety. Just to make it easier, I'll give you an example. I've had 2 panic attacks in my life, and I'll tell you about one. I had I used to work at a grocery store, when I was, in college. I was in college for a long time, so the beginning part of when I was in college. So I was 18 or 19-year-old working in a grocery store, and right before Thanksgiving. It was really super busy. I don't like people. I don't like crowds anyway, so it makes me anxious. But it's super busy. So I'm on my feet for 8 or 10 hours. That night, things were starting to settle down. We were about to close. It was very quiet. And I felt like this. The first thing was I felt dizzy and sweaty. And then I started having the racing heart, the heart palpitations, and then just this fear, oh my God, am I having a heart attack? Am I dying? I'm an 18-year-old kid who don't often drop dead from heart attacks while not doing anything physical or exerting any physical force. And this went on for 5 or 10 minutes. I went outside and just sat down outside, and it continued, and then it sort of lessened over time. And it was not immediately clear what the trigger was. At that exact time, things were pretty calm. There was no an abundance of activity. It wasn't super busy in the store. So I didn't really make the connection until later on, actually, when I'm teaching classes like this and talking about it, that the trigger was all of the stuff earlier, but adrenaline kind of pushes you through. So, think about if you're coming home from work one night, somebody jumps out of the bush and, says, give me all your money. You take off running and you escape. You're fine in the moment. Adrenaline's carried you through, but you wake up in the middle of the night with all of these symptoms. It's sort of an unexpected trigger. That's still pretty traumatic, and you're probably going to be able to draw that line to it. But what happens if, 2 or 3 days later, you're walking to class and all of a sudden you have a panic attack? You may not even remember, that you're in a similar place to where this, somebody jumped out and threatened you, and it becomes more unexpected. So the farther away you get in time from the stressor, the harder it is to kind of tie that down. So, but that is a factor. And on your PowerPoint slides, you'll see the DSM criteria. And I won't read this for all of them, but I will for this one. Just because this is our first disorder and the first time we're going to be talking about this. So the criteria set out an abrupt surge of an intense fear or discomfort that reaches the peak within minutes. and during which time 4 or more of the following symptoms occur. Every time we get the criteria, we're going to have a number of symptoms that have to be met in order to meet the diagnostic criteria. This one is 4. Also, every time you will have a time duration. So over what period of time, and we'll get to that later. Here, it reaches peak within minutes. 4 or more symptoms. You can have 5, you can have 6, you can have 10, but you have to have at least 4. Here they are: palpitations, pounding heart, accelerating heart rate, sweating, trembling, shortness of breath or smothering, feelings of choking, chest pain or discomfort, nausea, abdominal distress, feeling dizzy, unsteady, lightheaded or faint, chills or heat sensation, numbing or tingling sensations, derealizations, a feeling of unreality, or depersonalization. Also, fear of losing control or going crazy, fear of dying. Fear of depersonalization, meaning you feeling like you are outside of your body, sort of a separation from reality there. So you have to have 4 or more of those in order to meet criteria for a panic attack. So when we talk about the reasons that we have anxiety, so there is a heritability. Some of these kind of run in families. Back up just a second. When we talk about panic attacks, that is a sort of a building block of all of the different disorders that we'll talk about in a little bit. So we're kind of going out a little bit out of order here, but when we talk about what causes anxiety, it can be a genetic contribution. Sometimes you have more anxiety in families. We all have family members who have a lot of anxiety, and that tends to run in families. If your parents are more anxious people, then you're more likely to be anxious too. Is that nature or nurture? Is that because of genetics or because you grew up in that environment where anxiety was normalized? It can be either. Also, brain circuits, depleted levels of GABA, one of those neurotransmitters in your brain, deficits of norepinephrine or serotonin are also linked to anxiety. Your fight or flight system. When we're talking about panic attacks, all of those signs and symptoms of a panic attack are also activation of your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight system in your body. So if someone startles you, those are all common symptoms of that reflex, that part of our brain. So it's a very neurological type condition. Also some psychological factors, just the fear of things being uncontrollable or unpredictable lead to more anxiety. And also stressful life events can trigger anxiety attacks. Dealing with things like we are now. You see more anxiety and not specific to COVID-related anxiety, but more anxiety because more of your life is uncontrollable. More of your life is kind of outside of what you normally expect now than it has been in the past. And so we have more issues with anxiety right now that aren't directly linked to it, but are definitely like our current experience is a factor in the increased rates of anxiety. I mentioned the conditioned responses earlier. That certainly is a factor whenever we're talking about anxiety disorders. We can be conditioned to be anxious of certain stimuli. Anxiety and fear are largely learned responses. Also, catastrophic thinking, fearing that we're going to die or something horrible is going to happen, that really feeds into anxiety disorders. And I mentioned that with panic attacks, the feeling that you're going to die, something really bad is going to happen. Then we have these integrated models where it's not just one of these things. We have this triple vulnerability. We have the biological factor, the genetic predisposition to be anxious, psychological vulnerabilities, and then just more specific vulnerabilities. Also, we have a lot of comorbidity here. People who have anxiety disorders, I mentioned this I think last week when I brought up comorbidity. We have people who have more than one diagnosis. So a lot of people who have anxiety disorders have depression. A lot of people with anxiety disorders have substance use or drug abuse disorders as well. And there does tend to be a relationship between anxiety and depression. A lot of the symptoms are the same, a lot of the treatments are the same. So as we're going throughout some of the anxiety disorders that we'll talk about these different amounts, or some of them probably not at all, but some of the ones that are in your textbook: generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, agoraphobia, social anxiety disorder, and specific phobias. We won't really talk about selective mutism just for sake of time, and also separation anxiety. Although I just a few minutes ago saw a news story about children returning to school after this long period of time, nearly a year, not quite a year, but our kids have been out of school for quite some time, and whenever school starts, if school ever starts again, a lot of kids are going to have trouble being away from home. You see that at the beginning of the school year normally, but now we've had the beginning of the school year, we've had this long summer break. We had a period of time in the last semester where there were no class, and now this huge break in this semester too. And so it does stand to reason that we'll have some separation anxiety. So I may post that if I can find that article. I just saw it on the news live, so I'll have to go back and look for a video. A couple of things that I'll get into that later. I will post a few videos this week, just because I think there's some good examples and things that I've used before. And so I'll post those probably maybe tomorrow. I don't know. It'll take me the rest of the night to post this video. So, generalized anxiety disorders. First one we'll talk about: chronic worry. People who worry all the time. I think of this as like somebody's grandmother who's always worried that you're going to be dead, or something terrible is going to happen to you. Generalized anxiety disorder does happen more commonly in older people. One of the few psychological disorders that happens more often in older people. Most of these disorders tend to pop up a lot with young people, but this one is more pronounced in elderly populations. The defining features here: fear, excessive feeling of uncontrollable anxiety, apprehension, and worry about everything: work, relationships, your health. A lot of people who have generalized anxiety disorder are people who are constantly worried about their health. They're always worried, and maybe they have a lot of health issues, so there's legitimate concern there, but the level of worry is excessive. And it's also accompanied by a lot of physical complaints. Your stomach hurt. You think about being anxious all the time. This activation of your sympathetic nervous system. You're constantly in this fight or flight, and so you have a lot of tension. Your muscle tension, headaches, stomach aches, pain in your shoulders. Most of our anxiety and tension is held in our back and shoulders, so people have a lot of muscle fatigue and tension. Irritability, trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating. All of those are factors of generalized anxiety disorder. The diagnostic criteria for this are here. Anxiety and worry occurring more days than not for at least 6 months. Again, it has a time period. All the disorders are going to have a time period, and a number of symptoms that have to be met. So for 6 months or more, so this is a long-term thing, and it affects, and it has to be about a number of events, such as school or work performance. You find it difficult to control the worry, so it happens for 6 months. It's hard to control, and it's associated with 3 or more of the following symptoms: restlessness or feeling keyed up, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep problems. The anxiety and worry cause significant distress, and it's not due to physiological effects of substances. So it isn't because you're drunk or you're high. It isn't because you're withdrawing from substances. And it's also not better explained by another mental disorder. So those things are, if you're looking at the PowerPoint slide, and this is 19 on mine, so I assume it'll be 19 on yours, but we're looking at D and E. Those two are going to be there for every disorder, just worded a little bit different. It causes significant impairment in social, occupational, or other areas, and it's not better explained by substance use or medical conditions or another disorder. That's going to be in every single disorder that we talk about. usually in that order. As these are laid out, usually A, or the first thing, is the criteria about length of time, and then the last parts of it are that it must be clinically significant, and that it can't be caused by something else. How common is generalized anxiety disorder? I said anxiety disorders are pretty common. This is about 3% of the population. Just in comparison, something like schizophrenia is about 1% of the population, so it's much more common than that. Females are more anxious than males. Caught him back by popular demand. He just walked by and I decided to interrupt things. I have ADHD, so I can get back on track. This is my growing kitty. He's much bigger than last time I showed you, but several comments about him, so I decided to say hi. Hi, buddy. Okay, go back. I have a bigger cat, but I can't really lift him up. He's huge. 3% of the population, 2 to 1 female to male, so much more women than men. Onset often begins in early adulthood, but very prevalent among elderly and also very genetic. It runs in families. Let me rephrase that. It runs in families, so there is a genetic component, but there's also a environmental component. People in families that probably worry, and it's a combination of factors. But these folks we refer to them as autonomic restrictors. I don't know who refers to them as that. Your textbook says that, but I've never used that term aside from when I'm teaching this class. But they have less physiological response than other people with anxiety disorders. And the reason here is because they're always anxious. So their arousal level, if like a person with a phobia is going to be, so on a scale of 0 to 100, a person with a phobia might be a 90 when they experience whatever they're phobic to. So they see a spider, it might be a 90 or 95 or even 100. A person with generalized anxiety disorder is always at this state of arousal, so they're always going to be like a 50. So when they find something they're really, really anxious about, they might be a 70. So they're not quite as high on the arousal level as some other people, but they're constantly at this state of anxiety. So it becomes very taxing. Treatment doesn't work very well. Why, you might ask? People who are anxious don't go to treatment. If you're afraid of everything and you're anxious about everything, it's going to be hard to get you in for treatment. If you're just afraid of dogs, I can get you in. There's a pretty good chance we can work out a way to get to therapy without running across any dogs. But if you're worried about dying all the time, if you're worried that you go out in public, you're going to get COVID or you're going to get pneumonia and it's going to kill you, guess what? You're not going to go out in public. These people are hard to get into therapy. Silver lining with the increase in telehealth, communicating via computer, it's going to be easier. Getting to people who are anxious in their own home, this may be the one group of people who we want to reach out to, we've always had a hard time reaching out to, that we may be able to get to now. So it's kind of cool. But when you are in treatment, you're going to use cognitive behavioral techniques, trying to challenge those negative thoughts that may encourage the worry, the fear of dying all the time. You may be able to challenge those and get people to come to an understanding that they're really not likely to die from whatever it is that they're worried about. Just replacing those negative thoughts with something more positive and challenging those beliefs. We also have medications like benzodiazepines, like Xanax and Valium. Antidepressants work pretty well. Things like Prozac and Paxil work work really well for anxiety. And then combination of those two things. So I'm gonna pause this here. We're about 30 minutes in. I'm gonna pause this here, and then I'll upload this, and then I'm going to make a second volume. So when you watch this is not the end, it's just the beginning. It's like the middle. What am I kidding? So stay tuned.